Hello, welcome back everybody. This is MTG Burgeoning, and today we are running a modern deck tech Simic Merfolk. That's right, blue-green Merfolk in modern in this video right now. And we're going to start with our Merfolk, of course. We are going to play with a playset of Kamina's Speaker, a 1 green drop as a 1/1 that gets +1/+1 if you control another Merfolk or an island. So the best way we can use this, turn 1, we drop Kamina's Speaker. Turn 2, we drop a general and we swing with a 3/3. A 3/3 value with 1 green. That's not bad at all. And we're going to have islands in this deck, so minimally this is going to act as a 2/2 for a green. That is an auto include in this deck. Our next Merfolk is going to be a playset of the Curse Catcher. First printed in Shadowmoor, this allows us to keep those pesky opponents' instant and sorcery spells from affecting us, our board, or our health. We'll sack this guy to counter an instant or sorcery spell unless its controller pays 1. 4 of them auto include. So this Merfolk deck is running 8 1-drop Merfolks. 4 green and 4 blue. Next, we're moving to our 2 drops. And the first one, of course, the first one has to be the guy who started it all. He is our first Lord. He is the Lord. He is the Lord of Atlantis. All Merfolk gaining Island Walk and +1/+1 while this card is in play. Now, of course, the errata was changed when this was reprinted in the Time Spiral block. Playset of the Lord of Atlantis. Our next 2-drop, let's say, is another Lord of Atlantis. Kind of. Master of the Pearl Trident is 2 blue for a 2/2, and other Merfolk creatures I control get +1/+1 and have Island Walk. 4 of these babies going in. That brings our general total up to 8. Next up in this Simic Merfolk modern deck tech is another general, one of our more recent ones, the Merfolk Mistbinder. For a green and a blue, other Merfolk you control get +1/+1. So not as powerful as the Lord of Atlantis, not as powerful as the Master of the Pearl Trident, but a +1/+1 general for 2 that will fit our needs very well. 1 playset of the Merfolk Mistbinder. Next up, we have 2 copies of Phantasmal Image. This can come into play as a copy of any creature on the battlefield. Preferably, we're going to want to target one of our generals. And it's going to pump up our team if we get to a general, or it's going to give us some other abilities if we target a different Merfolk. 2 Phantasmal Images. 2 copies, Phantasmal Image. Next up, we're going for a play set, and you notice we're still in 2-drop mode. We're going to go a play set of the Silvergill Adept. A 1 and a blue for a 2/1. We reveal a Merfolk from our hand, which, let's be honest, we got a lot of Merfolk in this deck. Or we pay 3 more. This comes into play, we draw a card. So as long as we got that Merfolk in our hand, we show that bad boy, we cast this guy, we draw another card to replace him. Hopefully it's another Merfolk. 4 Silvergill Adepts. Alright, next up, as we keep it in the 2 mana cost slot, we have a playset. We have 4 of the Merfolk Trickster. For 2 blue, as a 2/2 with flash, when the Merfolk Trickster enters the battlefield, we tap target creature an opponent controls. It loses all abilities until end of the turn. Like there aren't an infinite number of modern creatures that are there because of their abilities, right? So auto include 4 of them, no questions asked there. And we come to our 3 mana slot, and this is as high as this deck is going to go. We are not going to look to cast any spells that are greater than 3, particularly when it comes to our Merfolk. So, with a play set in mind, we're going to bring one more general into the fray, and we are going to put a play set of the Muro Readery into play. For 2 and a blue and a 2/2 body, he gives other Merfolk you control +1/+1, and whenever you cast a Merfolk spell, you may tap or untap target permanent. 4 copies of the Muro Readery right into play. And lastly, we've got 2 more slots for Merfolk, and those 2 slots are going to go to Kapala, the Warden of Waves. For 1 and 2 blue on a 2/2, spells your opponents cast that target a Merfolk casts 2 more, and abilities your opponents activate that target a Merfolk you control cost 2 more. 2 copies of this, and 2 copies of the Phantasmal Image, and 4 copies of every other card brings our total of 36 Merfolk. So we're running 36 Merfolk in this deck. We have exactly 4 non-creature spells in this deck. That's it. We're Merfolk heavy. We are looking to stomp our opponents as quickly as we can. And a way in which we can do that is by including a playset of Force of Negation. A wonderfully powerful contribution from Modern Horizons. This can act as protection for our board, protection for our lands, making sure that our Merfolk can survive and move forward for the victory. 4 copies, Force of Negation, only non-creature spells in the entire deck. That's it. 36 Merfolk, 4 Force of Negations, brings us to 40 cards, and then we're left with 20 lands. Now, with the inclusion of green in this Simic deck, and there is not a ton of it, I get that. There's only 8 cards that have a splash of green in there. But still, I don't want to get hung up with there being any problems with not getting the green. So many of the cards that we're running are going to make sure that we get blue or green at our disposal. And the first play set of non-basic lands that's going to help us reach that goal is the Unclaimed Territory. We put this into play, choosing Slivers, of course. We get a blue or a green, which allows us to cast any sliver in our deck, and it also gives us a colorless mana. Now, holding the Force of Negations in our hand, we don't necessarily have to pay the mana cost on those cards, so we won't very often run into situations where this card is going to hinder or hamper our mana. Okay, so that's a play set of Unclaimed Territory, 4 of those bad boys. Next up, similar to the card we just showed, is the Ancient Ziggurat. Ziggurat. You're going to tap to add a mana of any color that can only be used to cast creature spells. Again, we only have 4 non-creature spells in this deck. So we're going to tap it for a blue, or we're going to tap it for a green, and we're going to play 4 of them. So that's 4 Unclaimed Territories, 4 Ancient Z's. Next up, we're going to put a little protection because we're never sure when we're going to come into a control deck, so we're going to throw in a couple copies of Cavern of Souls. This is similar to what Unclaimed Territory does for us, except when we use colored mana, which will be blue or green, that's generated from these lands, and we cast a spell of the chosen type, which of course will be Slivers, that spell cannot be countered. So 2 copies, Cavern of Souls, again, blue or green. Okay, next up, we are going to have a play set of a Simic staple breeding pool. 4 of them. Very easy. Put it into play. If you need it to come into play untapped, you're going to pay 2 life. You're going to have access to your blue, access to your green, and we're playing with 4 copies of it. 4 breeding pools. So there we go. So that is 14. That's 14 lands right there. That'll give you blue or green, no questions asked, with the minimal hindrance of paying 2 life. 6 more lands to go. And the next 4 is going to be a play set from another contribution from Modern Horizons, Waterlogged Grove. This one could get pricey in the long run, but we're not looking to play a long game. We're looking for our merfolk to show up, hit the beach, win the game, and then go back home. We're going to tap to pay a life for a green or a red, or this gives us the underrated ability of tapping 1 and sacking it to draw a card. Maybe we're looking for a general, maybe we're looking for a Kapala. Lots of versatility here, and that's why we're playing with a play set of Waterlogged Grove. That brings our land count up to 18. And the last 2 lands that we're going to play in this deck are going to be Botanical Sanctums. Comes into play tapped unless we have 2 or fewer lands. So hopefully this doesn't come up in an integral part of the game where we need to play a land that comes into play untapped. In a perfect world, these are the first 2 lands in our hand every game, every time we play with this deck. And that concludes the mana base of this Simic Merfolk Modern deck. Now, as for sideboarding, sideboarding is a little tough because sideboarding is, it's meta dependent, it's intuitive, and depending on where your meta game is and depending on who you're playing against, the sideboarding can be a little tricky. So as opposed to putting in multiples of cards and trying to guess where I'm going to take this sideboard, where I'm going to take this deck if I don't know where the meta game is, I'm just going to show some of the sideboard cards that are most powerful, most meaningful, most helpful to this deck, and explain how this helps with some of the matchups you may see when you sit down to play with this Simic Merfolk deck in a modern matchup. And the first card is going to be Dismember. This is just spot removal. We don't have to pay any, black mana. It'll cost us 4 life, but to get rid of some other troublesome creatures, it may be worth it for a colorless and 4 life. So Dismember is part of our sideboard. Another sideboard card that we're going to add is a 3rd copy of Kapala. Now we're going to keep Kapala as an additional copy just in case we get into a burn matchup, just in case we get into any kind of decks where they're going to be targeting our merfolk hot and heavy. We want as many ways in which to combat that as possible. So an additional copy of Kapala is going to be in our sideboard. To splash a little more green into the Simic build, Collected Company can be used. For 4 mana, we're going to look at the top 6 cards of our library. We're going to put 2 creature cards with converted mana cost 3 or less. Now, that shouldn't be hard. Every creature in this deck is 3 or less. So hopefully you hit this, it sticks, you're putting a couple of generals into play, and that's going to be the game very quickly. Another green entry into this that could help against burn or a lot of other decks that are looking to do very bad, atrocious things to our merfolk is the Heroic Intervention. 1 and a green, permanents we control gain hexproof and indestructible. A great card to cast when you're trying to close it out. This next potential sideboard card really doesn't need me to explain a lot about it. It pretty much says it in its text going back to the Kamigawa series when it first debuted, Pithing Needle. This comes into play, you name a card, activated abilities of the named card can't be played unless they're mana abilities. This is going to shut down a lot of different things. A lot of planeswalkers, a lot of creatures, just a lot of artifacts. This is nearly an auto-include in the deck before I even sit down to play it. Pithing Needle. Next up, we're going to go back to splashing some green, and this is for our ability to deal with Affinity, Force of Vigor. This is going to be very helpful if we know we're playing against Tron, or I'm sorry, not Tron, if we know we're playing against Affinity. Throw a play set of these in. We've got green cards in there to help pay for the mana cost. It's going to destroy 2 artifacts or enchantments. 4 of. If we're playing against Affinity, 4 of. Now, another card from Modern Horizons and another green entry. The Collector Oof. This hurts me a little bit, I'm going to be honest, because this isn't a merfolk. So if we were to include this in our deck as a sideboard option, we know that it's not a Merfolk. So that, to me, from a flavor standpoint, and I understand that's the Vorthos in me, that's going to bug me. But if it helps to shut down artifacts, well, let's do it. Let's do what we have to get rid of the affinity player. That's the collector oof. As long as we're on this anti-artifact kick, we're going to go back to blue and we're going to show Hurkyl's Recall. You're playing against Affinity or any other decks that are just ripe with artifacts. Let's put them all back into their hands. Hurkyl's Recall, 1 in a blue. Very easy to slide that baby in there. And we're coming up on the last few cards that are potential sideboard options when you're playing Simic Merfolk in Modern. And the next one comes from Dominaria, and it is Damping Sphere. This helps to host Tron. This helps to host Storm. This is a very versatile artifact that can slip in 2 colorless and do a lot of work for you. Damping Sphere is one of my sideboard options. Speaking of Tron, let's turn those lovely Urza lands into islands by using Spreading Seas. 1 in a blue, Spreading Seas enters the battlefield. It replaces itself by allowing you to draw a card, and the land it enchants, it's an island. Goodbye, Urza's Tower. Goodbye, Urza's Power Plant. Goodbye, Urza's Mine. Spreading Seas in the sideboard. All right. Next up, a little outside the box here. Ashiok, the Dream Render. This is the only Planeswalker we have included in the sideboard and in the deck itself, of course, but what she does is too powerful. Spells and abilities your opponents control can't cause their controller to search their library. No fetch lands, no looking through your library for anything. Additionally, her -1 ability, allowing target player put the top 4 cards of their library into their graveyard, then exile each opponent's graveyard. Like graveyards aren't important in Modern, right? Yeah, Ashiok, auto-include in the sideboard. No questions asked there. And then finally, our last potential sideboard card, again focusing on graveyard hate, is going to be our Grafdigger's Cage. Creature cards can't enter the battlefield from graveyards or libraries, and players can't cast cards in graveyards or libraries. And this is going to close out the sideboard options, for me at least. I mean, you can definitely do it. Like I said earlier, it's meta-dependent, it's intuitive. And in scrolling through our sideboard options, keeping in mind we're only playing 20 lands, so we are definitely keeping the mana cost down. Collected Company is the most mana-intensive spell that we're going to actually cast, and keeping in mind that the Force of Vigors are in there primarily to utilize as their, Force of Will mechanic. All right, folks, that is Simic Merfolk in Modern. Do you play Merfolk? Do you have a Merfolk build? What do you play when you take your decks to Modern? Let me know in the comments. What would you do differently? What would you add? What would you take out? This is MTG Burgeoning, folks, and this was Simic Merfolk in Modern. We are out.